Chapter 461. In the evening, Maisie went to pick up Riley. Riley was wearing a suspender skirt and had a pair of ponytails, looking pure and energetic. She got into the car and fastened her seat belt. "Why would you think of asking me out for a drink all of a sudden?" Maisie had already started the car and departed. She only gave off a depressing smile. "I'm in a bad mood." "You and Nolan, did you quarrel or what?" Riley sensed her emotions. "Wasn't everything fine between the two of you before you went to Stoslow?" Maisie's eyelashes twitched, but she could not bear to utter the sentence, "We're going through a divorce in the end." She did not say it, maybe because she wanted to maintain the marriage in front of others. Even if she was only lying to herself for a short moment. When they came to a bar, both of them ordered a cocktail, respectively. Riley stirred the drink with a straw and turned to look at her. "Z, are you okay?" Maisie paused for a split second but then changed the subject. "Are you planning to delay your marriage with Louis?" Riley took a glance at her and then muttered, "I don't want to get married either, but my dad, Aunt Lucas, and my aunt are all exceptionally optimistic about this marriage. You know me. I don't want to get married because of the connection that my family will benefit from. Can marriage without any love and affection be called marriage? What's more, Louis and I don't agree with each other all the time. We're always at each other's throats whenever we meet. Besides, I've looked into him. He has an ex-girlfriend who's a supermodel, and she has a beautiful figure and a bootylicious body when compared to me. But still, she broke up with him in the end. This means that the woman eventually regained her senses and could no longer stand his irritable temper." Maisie was about to say something when her gaze suddenly shifted onto the man who appeared beside Riley. She wanted to remind Riley. But Riley's chattering words and quick speech rate made it impossible for her to speak up. In the end, she could only reach out and pat her helplessly. "What are you patting me for? I don't think I'm wrong." "He's a vicious and emotionally unstable man," Riley continued to deliver her beliefs, but her voice became softer and softer. She then followed Maisie's line of sight and turned her head, only to see Louis standing beside her. Louis did not seem to have seen them. He only asked the bartender for 2 glasses of liquor. While Riley shifted nearer to Maisie subconsciously and whispered, "He didn't hear it, did he?" "I guess so." Maisie nodded. Louis, who took the liquor from the bartender, turned to look at the two of them. "Are the two of you here by yourselves?" Maisie gave off a faint smile. "Yes, cousin, are you here with your friends?" "What did you just call me?" Louis was a little surprised. After all, Maisie had never addressed him as her cousin. "My cousin." Maisie shrugged and then placed her hand on Riley's shoulder, trying to make herself look as normal as possible. "Aren't you going to invite me and my cousin-in-law over for a drink?" Riley shuddered and smacked her hand off her shoulder. "Who's your cousin-in-law?" "Z. This slut, all she knows is to make a fool out of me." Louis took a glance at Riley and then looked at Maisie again. "Come with me then." Maisie wrapped her arm around Riley's shoulders and caught up to Louis while Maisie hauled over Riley. When they arrived at the private room door, Maisie was surprised to find that Helios was sitting among the young men in the room. Riley was surprised, rushed over to Helios' side, and sat down. "Helios, you've always been a workaholic. Why would you be here, drinking?" Helios gave off a faint smile. "I'm free tomorrow. And that's rare, so I came out to get together with some friends." With that said, he looked up at Maisie, who was approaching them. "Ms. Vanderbilt, you're here too." Maisie nodded at him and took a seat in the corner. The other 3 men were dressed in eye-catching, exceptional clothes. Although their appearance and temperament were not as good as Helios and Louis's, they had their own merits, and they all knew Riley. Chapter 462. "Lou, it's strange that you actually called your fiancé here to drink with us." Tanner Hannigan was holding a red wine glass, and his gaze was fixed on Louis as he teased and chuckled. Louis did not respond to him. Riley threw the snacks on the table at him. Nonsense. What are you blabbering about over there? Tanner avoided the projectiles and laughed. We're all living in the same circle. Who wouldn't know about the engagement between the Hills and the Lucases? No one in the social circle did not know about the news about the engagement between the Hills and the Lucases. It was already a fact that had been planned and prepared round the clock. Even if Riley did not want to acknowledge the fact, she could not hide from it for the rest of her life. Donovan Santiago, sitting beside Louis, also teased Helios with a chuckle. Hells, are you still not going to start thinking about your marriage? Helios put down his glass. I'm not in a hurry. You're not in a hurry? You're almost the same age as Nolan. By the way, it's been several years since Nolan last came out with us for a get-together, hasn't it? Tanner looked at Donovan. He has a family now. He's no longer a bachelor like you who goes around flirting and picking up women. Hey, since when did you see me picking up women? Don't slander me. There are other women here in the room. Everyone's gazes shifted on to Maisie after Donovan said that. Maisie picked up the wine glass and shook it lightly. From the moment they came in until they started chatting, she only sat there in the corner, drinking alone. At that moment, a silhouette sat down beside her. Louis and Helios both looked a tad bit anxious. Jaden Lichtenberg did not know who Maisie was, and he had been drinking a little too much. His usual playboy style was exceptionally prominent when he placed his arms around her shoulder and said to the two, "You guys really have neglected this Belle for too long. And you actually allow her to sit here and drink by herself. But it doesn't matter. I'll drink with the Belle." Just as Riley was about to say something, Helios asked, coldly, "Jaden, do you know who she is?" Tanner and Donovan were aware of the change in Helios' expression. So they stared at Maisie for a long time and vaguely felt that she looked rather familiar. Jaden was already a little tipsy, so he did not care much. Who is she? How would I know that? Isn't she here to get drunk too? Helios was about to speak. But he saw Maisie clinking glasses with him. Yes, we're all here to get drunk, so let's have a good time tonight. Louis and Helios were obviously a little surprised by her calmness. They even felt that something was wrong with her. Riley suddenly leaned over and said to Jaden sullenly, "If you get drunk together with Mr. Goldman's wife, your head will most probably be floating on the Yerp River tomorrow." Mr. Goldman. Upon hearing these two words, Jaden sobered and looked at her. What did you just say? It turns out to be Mrs. Goldman. Tanner was very surprised. They had heard of her, but they had never seen her in person. It had been a sensation when Mr. Goldman announced their marriage. It had been published in the newspaper back then, so he finally recalled this familiar face. Jaden suddenly let go of his hand that was wrapping around Maisie's shoulders and shifted a little away from her. No matter how much of an imp he was, he would not dare to trick Mrs. Goldman into drinking with him. Louis got up, walked over, and sat in Jaden's seat. While Maisie only held the wine glass in her hand and had not taken a sip out of it. It was obvious to the eye that she was neither happy nor devastated. She was only feeling a little blue. She put down the wine glass and got up. You guys should continue drinking. I'll go out for a walk. Riley stood up. Unfortunately, Maisie had already left the private room. Riley wanted to go after her, but Helios held her back. He got up. I'll go. As a woman, she's not safe out there. And you going with her won't make much of a difference. Riley watched as Helios put on a mask and cap and went after Maisie, not knowing what she could do for a while. Chapter 463. Riley did not want to stay here alone, so she was grabbing her handbag when she turned around and found out that Maisie's phone was on the couch. Sigh, how did she? When she picked up the phone and tapped on the screen, she saw an unread text message when the screen lit up. She was obviously shocked when she saw the content of the text message. Louis looked at her. Is it her phone? Riley did not answer, picked up her handbag, and quickly dashed out of the room. Lou, what are they? Donovan asked, while the other two looked a little confused. Louis took a deep breath and got up. You guys should continue. I'll catch up to them and check things out. As soon as Riley walked out of the bar, Louis came up to her, held her, and said slowly, call Helios and ask him where he is. I'll take you there. Riley was still trapped in a daze. Louis thought she did not hear him and was about to say something when Riley suddenly looked up at him. Mr. Goldman wants to divorce C. Maisie was sitting on the bench beside a neon fountain. And when Helios arrived, she was the only person left in the park. Helios walked toward her. It's so late in the night now. Aren't you afraid that Nolan will worry about you if you stay in such a place alone? Will he worry about me? Maisie stopped talking, then looked up at him. The smile on her face became a little bit more indifferent. You shouldn't know that he wants to divorce me, right? It seems that he's made up his mind. He wants to divorce you? The momentary shock in Helios's eyes disappeared almost instantly. She continued. He's gotten the divorce papers drafted and printed out. What else can I do? Maisie gave off a smirk that was filled with self-mockery. He gave me custody of my children and also half of the shares of Black Gold. He's truly a considerate man, huh? He didn't argue with me. Didn't try to take anything from me, and even gave me shares. It's definitely a good deal for me to agree to the divorce. However, all I want to know is why he must divorce me. He clearly still cares for me and is still in love with me. Helios lowered his gaze and smiled. He could still think of this when he's trying to get a divorce. Do you know what it means to obtain half of Black Gold shares? Maisie did not say anything. Helios then said mildly, even if Nolan and other shareholders own half of the company's shares, if you own the other half, it means that you're the biggest shareholder of Black Gold. As he was saying so, he looked down at Maisie, who was sitting on the bench with a complex expression, and sighed. He's giving you the whole company in disguise. She was rather shocked. Nolan wants to give Black Gold to me in disguise? How can it be? Has he lost his mind? Helios sat down beside her. Nolan doesn't seem like someone who would play with women's feelings. He even thought of giving you the whole Black Gold through this divorce. If what you have with him was just a play to him, do you think you can get any of these things from him? Maisie remained silent. She had not thought too much about it when Nolan brought up the divorce. She had only thought that Nolan was using these to humiliate her and force her into agreeing to the divorce. You seem to know Nolan very well. She smiled. Helios's legs were crossed together. Although he was wearing casual and low-key clothing, a cap, and a mask, he still could not conceal his elegance. If Nolan were a glass of strong liquor, which was extremely intoxicating once consumed, then Helios would be a cup of tea. The more someone got to taste his temperament, the more intense their feelings for him would get. He then added, Nolan and I grew up together, and I used to envy him. Envy him? Maisie was startled. Helios is born without a lack of anything, with a famous family background, and his ancestors have been officials for generations. His status and identity should be envied by many instead, right? Chapter 464. Yes, I envied him for having parents who love him, and I envied the freedom that he has, Helios explained with a smile. The loneliness in his eyes made Maisie feel that he was indeed envious of Nolan. Helios added indifferently. Someone once told me that it will be a tragedy if humans don't have any dreams and don't have the guts to live for themselves, but only know how to follow the rules and survive this world, jumping from one day to another. He then turned to look at her. The person who said that was Nolan's mother, Aunt Natasha Knowles. Maisie opened her mouth, but did not speak. He continued to say slowly. The elders in my family have always been very strict. When I was young, besides learning etiquette and established practices, I also had to read various books to supplement my knowledge. And after I went to a private college, I had to learn even more things. Thus, I didn't have enough time to relax. I didn't even dare to hope to be able to make friends back then. Maisie understood that being born into a prestigious family would bless one with noble status, but the rules that one had to obey would be extremely strict, too. Then how did you and Nolan get to know each other? Maisie seemed to have a whim and wanted to know more about Nolan's childhood all of a sudden. Helios moved on with the story. My family punished me to kneel in front of the portraits of my ancestors because I made a mistake back then. I felt too aggrieved and ran away from the manor. That was when I ran into Nolan and his mother on the street. Helios had only been a few years old at the time, and Nolan was only 1 year older than him. Natasha had seen him crying helplessly in the corner. So she had stepped forward to ask him about his encounter and then brought him back to the Goldman mansion. From that time, he and Nolan had gotten to know each other. Helios would feel a sense of carefree happiness in the Goldman mansion. And there was where he could get to feel the warmth of a home. Natasha had been treating him very well. He would go to the Goldman mansion to play whenever he was free, and Natasha would make him his favorite snacks as if he were one of her sons. When Nolan noticed how much his mother liked Helios back then, he became very calculative and jealous and had always liked to talk back to him. And whenever he could not win in a quarrel or a fight, Nolan would just cry. Helios burst into laughter. But there were times when Nolan treated me well. He would give me medicine every time I was sentenced to kneel before the portraits, and my knees were slightly swollen. He would bring me along to play basketball with him when I told him that I had never played basketball. He was also the one who brought me to the beach when I told him that I had never seen the ocean. Although his father reprimanded us big time when he found us, Nolan was the one who stood up for me. There was even one time when he came to my house and scolded my grandfather just because he beat me up. And in order to help me vent my anger, he released all the canaries that my grandfather raised. Those canaries were very expensive. And it made my grandfather extremely exasperated back then. Maisie chuckled. Was he that naughty back then? Helios nodded. It wasn't until Aunt Natasha's accident that he changed completely. He no longer likes the fun and a stir, he's taciturn. And even his emotions are beyond comprehension. I hadn't seen him again for a few years after I graduated from high school. I only reunited with him again at a banquet that took place after he came back from college to take over Black Gold. Maisie lowered her gaze. Did you enter the entertainment industry because of his mother? Yeah. Helios looked at her. Because she once said to me that one can't control their origin, but their life is another story. I didn't want to be tied to the Bouchers all my life as my father did. I didn't want not to be able to do what I want to do and wait for my family to arrange everything for me. Do you know that my father couldn't even choose the woman that he has to live with for the rest of his life by himself? Chapter 465. Maisie stopped talking. I've heard from Sherry about the story between the Bouchers and the Knowles. If Yael hadn't given up on Natasha because of his family's arrangement back then, perhaps Nolan wouldn't have been the Nolan that I've known and loved. Helios wouldn't have been the Helios who's sitting right beside me either. Everything has already been predestined, and if I hadn't changed my mind back then, perhaps I would have never met Nolan. The absurd event from 6 years ago led us to tread into each other's life, sowing a seed that would only sprout later on. 6 years later, the gears of fate started turning again, causing us to run into each other once again. But isn't this all my choice? If I hadn't chosen to come back to Zlokavato fight for Vena but continued to enjoy the fame and fortune that I had earned in Staslo, I might have never met the father of my kids. Helios took a glimpse at his watch. It's very late already. I'll fetch you home. After hearing so much. Maisie didn't feel so bored anymore, so she got up and said, "Thank you. There's no need for you to be so polite around me. Since we're destined to cross each other's path, I regard you as a friend of mine." Helios smiled. Maisie and Helios came out of the park. only to see Nolan standing in front of the car staring at them gloomily. Maisie had not seen Nolan for several days. And when she got to see him again, she discovered that he seemed to have lost a lot of weight. Nonetheless, she was happy as he had come to find her. Maisie started to run toward Nolan, but she then heard him say to Helios indifferently, "If you like Maisie, you can have her as soon as we're done with our divorce." A short sentence was enough to stop her from moving forward instantly. Helios narrowed his eyes. "Would you be doing so willingly?" Nolan snorted. "She's just a woman. It's not that difficult to do so." Maisie's trembling heart felt as if it was being sliced open by a blade, her breath felt extremely heavy, and the joy and expectation on her face disappeared in an instant. Helios took a glance at Maisie and said unhurriedly, "Then why would you give her half of Black Gold's shares through the divorce? I don't think you're the type of person who would hand over such a large portion of Black Gold's share to others." Nolan's expression became tense. But he did not let anyone notice the hidden emotions at the bottom of his eyes. "At the end of the day, I don't need that share. I'm only doing so just to get her to leave. It's the same no matter who owns Black Gold in the end. What a coincidence. You'll be one of the final benefactors of this transaction." Helios frowned. Unexpectedly, a figure suddenly dashed up to Nolan and punched him on the cheek before Helios could make any move. Even Maisie was startled. Nolan, who was punched, found his balance immediately, stood on his feet, rubbed the corner of his bloody lips with his fingertips, and clicked his tongue. Lewis was pulled away by Riley, who had just caught up to him. "Lewis Lucas, have you lost your mind? He actually made a move on Nolan Goldman?" "Have I lost my mind?" Lewis asked, glaring directly at Nolan as his gaze became a little colder. "Nolan Goldman, don't think that I'm afraid of you just because you're one of the Goldmans. Since you don't know how to speak like a human, then I'll train you until you know how to behave as an animal." "You?" Nolan responded indifferently and without any hesitation. Riley kept pulling Lewis backward while she looked at Nolan and Maisie in astonishment. She had read the content of Maisie's text message by accident, and she could not believe it was true that Nolan wanted to divorce her. Not to mention that they had heard it all just now. How could Mr. Goldman utter such hurtful words? Riley gnashed her teeth. Although she was cowardly and was afraid of Nolan, he hurt Maisie, and she could not bear to witness that. "What do you think of Z? It was you who begged like a beggar, asking her to marry you in the beginning, wasn't it? And now that she's agreed to get married to you, you're kicking her away without even a proper explanation?" Nolan snorted coldly. The blood in his mouth was so vibrant that it looked very distinct from his pallid face. The contrast made him look like a vampire under the dark sky, looking all gloomy and cold. "So? I've grown tired of playing with her. Do you have a problem with that?" Chapter 466. Nolan, Lewis wanted to rush over and beat him up, but Riley was holding him back, and he couldn't just push her away. Lewis rarely lost his temper and would never fight someone without a valid reason, but Nolan crossed a line. "That's enough." Maisie looked calm as a statue. Her expression was impossible to read. Her fingers curled, turned cold, and shuddered. She looked at Nolan, her eyes finally turning red, and tears almost fell out of them. Still, Nolan wouldn't look at her. He didn't dare. "Nolan, what can you do to me if I choose not to proceed with the divorce?" Yes, she had lost her dignity, but she still wanted to try and salvage their relationship. She took a step back, but wouldn't accept the divorce. She wouldn't leave even if he chased her away. How could she believe that the man who had risked his life to protect her in Staslo didn't love her anymore, or that he was already tired of her? "Maisie, didn't you hear him? Getting a divorce with him would be your best choice." Lewis ground his teeth. He had treated her as his sister ever since she acknowledged that he was her cousin. When she wanted to be with Nolan, even if Hernandez was his grandfather, he never talked bad about him and never even thought of asking them to split up. However, He couldn't ignore what he had heard and seen. If Nolan couldn't appreciate her, the Lucases and Hernandez would. Riley was on Lewis's side because what he said made sense. Z, if he wants a divorce, you shouldn't continue to be blinded. We should leave. There's plenty of fish in the sea. They had seen how Nolan was. Tired? Planning to give her away to some other man after their divorce? How could someone say something like that? If she knew that that was going to happen, she should have just set Z up with her cousin. Furthermore, that was the first time she saw Z like that. If it were before, she wouldn't even have hesitated. Love was blind and would make people lose themselves, and Maisie was just another victim of it. But they couldn't know what Maisie and Nolan had gone through. Maisie smiled sadly. I want to be cruel like him too, but I want to know. She looked at him, trembling. Nolan, did what you said before still stand? He had said that no one would be able to break them apart unless he died. He had said that the only woman that he would marry would be Maisie. He had said that they would have a wedding that would make every socialite in Bassburg jealous. And in return, she had said she would never leave him. But did all that still stand? Nolan's lips were pressed into a thin, hard line. She hoped to see some reluctance in his eyes. But she didn't. He clenched his jaw as his deep eyes fell on her thin, but strong yet beautiful face, and said, I guess we have to do it by law. You know I've never lost a court case. Maisie, don't make it hard for yourself. Her heart shattered upon hearing those words. He wouldn't try to salvage it and would rather use the law to end this marriage. Nolan, do you really want to do that? Was this what he wanted? Nolan didn't say a thing. He opened his car door and stood there for a while before replying, there's not much time left to think about this. Chapter 467. There wasn't much time left. The door slammed shut, and the black car drove away, disappearing into the dark night. Maisie stood on the spot. When she lowered her head, the tears that had blurred out her vision fell to her shoes and splattered like a blooming flower. Riley ran to her and held her shoulders. Maisie, why wouldn't you let go when he's already you wouldn't understand. Maisie cut her off, the lights casting a long shadow and displaying her sad silhouette. After a long time, she said in a low voice, send me back to Vanderbilt Manor. Please. She never looked up. Helios stared at her for a while and said, I'll go get the car. Maisie was quiet all the way back. She took her phone, thanked Helios, and got out of the car without looking back when they arrived at the Vanderbilt Manor. Helios watched her walk to the door. He was in deep thought while frowning. He then picked up his phone and sent a message. In the meantime, at the Goldman mansion, Nolan walked into the room and immediately spat some blood out of his mouth. He supported himself on the railings of the stairs and coughed. He clung onto the railing with so much effort that the veins on the back of his hand showed up. I'm sorry, Z's eyes turned red. The devastation made him cough a few violent coughs. Alfred was shocked when he turned on the lights and walked down the stairs. Quincy brought a doctor over to the mansion in a hurry. The doctor walked into the room while Quincy and Alfred stood outside. Did he go outside? Quincy frowned, seeing Nolan's condition. They still couldn't let people know that he had contracted the virus because it would cause panic. The doctor said that he was in the stage after the incubation period, and he would have a fever for at least a few days. Medication to relieve fever and flu didn't help. All he could do was to ride it out. Alfred nodded. Yes. He went out and got worse when he came back. He looked into the room anxiously. Has he contracted some disease? Quincy wasn't sure if he should answer that. It was actually a disease. He looked at Nolan, who was lying in bed and getting looked at by the doctor. Guessing that he had probably gone to see Maisie. His phone broke his chain of thought. He saw that Titus was calling and immediately went aside to answer it. My flight will land in the morning. How is Nolan? Quincy hesitated upon hearing that Titus was rushing back. Not too good. There was silence on the other end of the phone. After a long time, take care of him. We'll talk more when I'm back. Maisie couldn't sleep all night. When she went down for breakfast in the morning, she looked pale and tired. The bags under her eyes were very obvious, while she looked depressed and heartbroken. Z, you should take a break and go on a trip if you can't take it. Stephen brought her a bowl of soup. You can't keep doing this. You're going to fall sick. Maisie just nodded. She took a few sips of the soup but didn't feel hungry. She had lost her appetite recently. She looked up. I'll get someone to bring the kids home for the next few days. She smiled with much effort. I don't want them to see me like this. Stephen agreed. She sent a message to Kennedy to inform him that she wouldn't be going to the office for the next few days. She went to the cafe that Riley was working at. Riley made her a cup of coffee and sat in the seat across from her. If you're going on a trip, bring me along. I can be your company. Chapter 468. Don't you need to work? Sigh, I can apply for time off. I just won't get paid for a few days. Riley waved her arm dismissively. Maisie picked up the coffee, took a sip, and started feeling nauseated. She immediately put down the cup and rushed to the washroom. Z? Riley stood up. Maisie rushed to the washroom and into one of the stalls. She started throwing up once she flipped the lid up. Z, are you all right? Riley stood outside. When she saw her throwing up, she looked surprised. Z, are you? Her mind went straight there. Maisie immediately froze. She had been feeling nauseated, didn't have an appetite, and her period was late. No way. Maisie flushed and walked out with a hand on her stomach, looking much paler. Riley was worried. Do you want me to go to the hospital for a checkup with you? Maisie didn't object. What if she really was pregnant? What should she do? Nolan wanted a divorce, so what would happen to the child? Riley brought Maisie to the hospital and was there for her checkup. Soon after, the results were as they suspected. Maisie was pregnant. The doctor placed the report on the desk and entered the details into the computer. You're 5 weeks pregnant. Be careful of your surroundings and make sure you stay positive. Too much anxiety might cause a miscarriage. Try to avoid sleeping in the same room. Maisie's hand that was on her belly twitched. She picked up the report, stood up, thanked the doctor, and walked out. Riley followed her, feeling sorry. Mr. Goldman is asking for a divorce, but now you're pregnant. That's such a joke. Maisie smiled sadly. It is. Right when they were getting a divorce, she got pregnant. If Nolan knew that she was pregnant, would he stop the divorce? When Maisie got to the hospital hall, the news was broadcast on the screen on the wall. Shocking development. Mr. Nolan Goldman and Ms. Maisie Vanderbilt ended their marriage and are in the process of divorcing. Hashtag Maisie's pupils shrunk, the red of her lips faded, and coldness crept up her feet. Announcing their divorce. Nolan was cornering her. Riley's jaw dropped, and she wanted to say something. But she saw Maisie rushing out. Z. Riley was shocked and immediately went after her. Maisie got into a taxi and left. Riley was too far behind. She started panicking, but an idea came to her mind, so she took out her phone to call Helios. Maisie looked out of the car window. And her tears started falling. She covered her mouth to stifle her cries. The scenery outside was just a blur. Riley called her a few times, but she didn't pick up. She wanted to get to the Goldman mansion and see Nolan. She couldn't believe that he would be so cruel. The sky turned dark, and dark clouds started forming overhead. When the car arrived at the Goldman mansion, Maisie jumped out of the car and ran in without looking back. But right when she got to the doors, the guards were standing outside and helplessly said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. But you can't go in. I want to see Nolan. Get out of my way." Maisie pushed them, and the two blocked her when they realized that she was going to rush in. "I knew you would come," a voice said. Titus walked over with a stoic expression. "Nolan won't see you. Leave. You're divorced. It's done." Chapter 469. He wouldn't ask for a divorce for no reason. Maisie was obviously upset, her eyes red. "Elder Master Goldman, I beg you, please let me see him." Titus clenched his jaw, but his expression remained. He made up his mind with the divorce. "Why are you still bothering him? Don't you think that you've gotten him in enough trouble? We won't challenge the rights to the children, and Nolan even gave you some of his shares. Isn't that enough?" Maisie's cold fingers turned pale. Was that what she wanted? No. Her voice shook. "I just want closure." Titus clenched his fist, which he was holding behind his back. When he remembered what his grandson had been through, his eyes looked cold. "Closure? I never agreed to you being together. I made him ask for the divorce. You're not good enough for him. If Nolan couldn't be adamant enough, he would be the bad guy who tore them apart." He gnashed his teeth and said, "Maisie, if you really care about Nolan, accept the divorce. We have given you enough leeway. If this goes to court and we force you to end the marriage by law, you will be caught in a tough situation. Furthermore, Nolan promised me that he wouldn't have anything more to do with you after this. You can hate me, but I won't see my grandson get hurt again. Don't worry. We'll take care of your kids, but you and Nolan will never work. Why can't you let go when he already has?" "Let go?" Maisie smiled a sad smile. Her heart felt as though it was cut in half, empty and painful. "Elder Master Goldman, at least, let me see him." "He won't see you. Leave." He waved his arm dismissively and turned around to go into the mansion without letting her see him. Maisie looked while the door closed, but didn't leave. The two guards looked at each other and said to her, Ms. Vanderbilt, you should leave." They even changed the way they addressed her. Maisie didn't move. The guard didn't say anything but just left, probably thinking that she would have left after a while. Quincy stood by the window and looked down sadly as he felt pain. He turned around to look at the man who was having a high fever in bed. How could Nolan see her in this state? The rain started pouring after she stood there for a long time. The sound of the rain covered any noise in the area. The cold rainwater drenching her face and blending in with her tears. The piercing cold rain enveloped her while she held her fist tight, not planning to leave. Titus sat on the chair next to the bed and rested his eyes, his hands crossed on his legs. Quincy walked to him. "Elder Master Goldman, Ms. Vanderbilt is still not leaving." Titus slowly opened his eyes. So what if she hasn't left? Can Nolan meet her like this? Quincy lowered his head. If she wants to wait, let her wait. Titus didn't soften up. She'll leave when she's done. Quincy frowned. He should send a message to Sherry so that she can come and take Maisie away. In the rain, Maisie's eyes darted, her body no longer warm. She had been waiting for Nolan to show up, but he never did. Why, Nolan? Why do you have to be so cruel? Her vision started to blur. And she leaned backward because her head felt heavy. Just when Maisie's head was spinning, someone caught her by her shoulders, and she fell into the person's arms. She lost consciousness before she could see who it was. Chapter 470. The familiar smell of medical disinfectants made Maisie open her eyes. All she could see was the white ceiling. "You're awake, Z?" Riley asked with a smile when she saw her. Stephen and Sherry were also in the room. After fainting, he had heard Sherry say that Maisie had been sent to the hospital and rushed over, worried. "Z, the doctor said you need to rest well. You're pregnant and almost lost it because you were too agitated." Maisie was stunned. She ran her hand over her belly and felt a little guilty as she had almost put the child in danger. She weakly said, "Who brought me here?" She remembered seeing someone before passing out. Riley pursed her lips, knowing that she was expecting something. It was my cousin. His assistant called him away. Maisie pressed her lips together while blinking. Sherry went to help when she saw that she was trying to sit up. If her brother hadn't told her, she wouldn't have known, and Maisie was pregnant. After a long time, she calmly said, "Can you leave, please? I would like to be alone for a little while." Sherry hesitated, but Riley consoled her, "All right, we'll leave for now. Rest well." Stephen nodded too. Maisie leaned on the headboard when they left and looked out at the rain. Her eyes were dead. At the Goldman mansion. What? Ms. Vanderbilt is pregnant? Quincy picked up Sherry's call and was shocked at the news. Why was she pregnant at that time? Wouldn't Nolan be? Quincy looked toward the room but couldn't make a decision. He could just wait for him to wake up. Titus walked in. What's going on? Quincy paused, unsure if he should tell him. Sherry called. Titus sounded impatient. Isn't that girl with Maisie? What's the worry? What should they worry about? What could have happened to her compared to the suffering his grandson was going through? Maisie fainting in the rain wasn't a big problem. He walked into the room while Quincy hung up the phone and walked in after him. Before he could speak, Titus suddenly said, "Find some time to get Maisie to sign the divorce papers." Buta, but what? Titus turned around to look at him. I've let the news slip. Do you want it to drag on longer? When Nolan wakes up, this will never end. He sounded cold. If he can't let go, I have to help him get this over with. Quincy was quiet. He knew that Nolan was doing this to force her to sign the papers. But if Maisie refused to sign them, there was no way he could force her into a corner. Nolan was just trying to make her leave by her own will. At that moment, Titus received a call from his son, Nicholas. He had probably seen the news. 3 days later. Maisie stood by the window, looking at the people walking by. After the rain the previous day, the air was humid with the smell of fresh grass and soil. Sherry brought some food over, opened the door, and was surprised. Why are you out of bed? Maisie looked back. I just wanted to stretch my legs. She then asked. When can I be discharged? Maisie had been in the hospital for 3 days and had gotten bored. She was also worried about the children and wouldn't let her father nor Sherry tell them about her stay at the hospital.